Hey everyone, welcome to This Is What Democracy Looks Like. This is the first in a series of Facebook Live events that Stronger NC will be sponsoring. And we'll have a rotating group of panelists, bipartisan politicians hopefully, and average citizens and experts from all walks of life. So we decided to set these up and have discussion on one topic so that we can do a deep dive, gain a better understanding on those topics, and have an opportunity to provide you with more information and resources and some very specific calls to action. These are going to occur on the first Tuesday of the month at 7:30 p.m. And you'll be able to find a lot of resources at the Stronger NC Facebook page. I think we also have created a This Is What Democracy Looks Like Facebook page as well. And we'll have more information about that later on. So, my name is Lulu, or Laura, but my Stronger NC friends know me as Lulu. This is my colleague, Crystal, who's our expert tonight. And essentially, I'm going to be moderating and asking some questions and keeping us moving on our topic, which tonight, our first topic, is an overview topic and to launch us into our Facebook series. So, Crystal, do you want to introduce yourself and take us from there?
Sure. I'm Crystal Arand. I'm a local writer, historian, strategist, consultant. I wear a few different hats. But history is one of my great loves. And so today, normally we're going to kind of go through one topic per episode. But today we really want to talk about why North Carolina and why North Carolina matters historically to the rest of the nation. And so this episode will be a little different, a little bit more of a survey. But going forward, there'll be more of a deep dive into one very specific topic.
Cool. And this will be carried on as more of a conversation. So we'll be flipping back and forth a little bit and taking some questions from our viewers. You'll see us glancing around a little bit at our notes, but Crystal is very good at this and will be able to take us through the evening.
Right. So hopefully I won't rant too much on any particular topic, but I thought what we would do is kind of look at things through this lens of Reconstruction and then periods of, really destruction. We can look at it as disruption. Of course, history is not that black and white. We don't have this pendulum that swings very neatly. But I think for our purposes and really showcasing why North Carolina matters to the rest of the nation, it's helpful to kind of look at it through this disruption and reconstruction kind of lens. So if we want to start, why don't we start in the late colonial period. In late colonial North Carolina, we actually had something very few people have heard of called the War of Regulation. This was, in many ways, kind of a mini American Revolution that happened about 10 years before the actual American Revolution. But it was the same issues. It was taxation without representation. It was lack of redress. And so really a team of people came together from across the state, and these were farmers, these were merchants. These were people that did not necessarily have any background in politics of any kind and came together to start protesting, these types of treatments. So unfortunately, the regulator movement was put down fairly quickly and very violently by Governor Tryon. But those same seeds from that colonial era, they definitely continued. And one thing I did want to highlight from that era too, there was a women's Edenton tea party. So this is something that not many people have heard about, but this is in 1774. A group of 50 women got together in Edenton, threw their own tea party. And this was a really big deal then. Women were not involved in politics.
They weren't even allowed to vote.
Of course, yeah. So years before that, and in fact, when it finally did hit the English newspapers, the commentary was mostly, we hope that the rest of the colonial women don't have the same artillery as the women in North Carolina. Yes. So we see really early on this sort of spirit, this fighting spirit, this rebellious spirit, all the way back into the colonial times.
Cool. Yeah. Well, so what about that regulator leadership? Did they have any part then in the Revolutionary War that followed, or?
Yeah, so really interestingly, the leadership from the regulation, it was very mixed. For the most part, they were led by a Quaker and named Herman Husband. He was banned from the colony after his participation, so he goes back to New England and does some things there. But other folks, like Richard Caswell, was actually a militia captain underneath Tryon who helped put the regulation down. Later, you'll see him coming back up. He changes sides, and he becomes a colonel in the Patriot cause.
Wow. So what are some more specifics then about NC quickly through the Revolutionary period?
So I think a few things with the Revolution. Again, I just want to mostly touch on things that aren't well known. North Carolina really changed the course of the American Revolution. There were some very early...
We did that then, we do that now, right?
Yes, we do. Definitely that history of leadership. So North Carolina was the very first to allow their representatives to declare independence from Great Britain. So this is very famous during the Halifax Resolves. This is early 1776. So we were the first to say, yes, we want to formally break away from Great Britain. Interestingly, we were the last to ratify that Constitution. And so that's something that North Carolina has kind of gotten some flack for over the years, but it was for a really important reason, which was North Carolina representatives at the time would not sign until we had a Bill of Rights. And this is something they had learned historically, that even the Magna Carta failed because there was no legal recourse to what it actually meant. Otherwise, it's just ideals. So anyway, we get the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 of our amendments, comes out of this period, and again, out of North Carolina, leading that charge to make sure we had the accompanying laws.
There's some interesting things around here as well, some interesting battles that we were involved in North Carolina that were specific to that time.
So there are a few really good ones, and we're lucky that there's a lot of history and a lot of living history here too. Right outside of Wilmington, we've got the Battle of Morse Creek, and that was one that I think was important just in the sense that the North Carolinians were, we were outnumbered. We had very little in the way of artillery, rifles, etc., and yet still managed to win a very stunning victory there. And we did that really through innovation. The Patriots had set up a fake position, basically, and put up their camp and fires elsewhere to throw off the British. They had removed planks from one of the bridges and greased the trusses. And even without horsepower, they had dragged a cannon by hand. So men had dragged that cannon to the site. So stunning victory. I think there were 2 casualties on the Patriot side and over 800 prisoners taken from the British side. So a real example of using what was available to you. So definitely that kind of innovation. Yeah. Flipping all the way to the very end of the war, I think what changed the outcome was the battle at Guilford County Courthouse. And this was definitely a loss for the Patriot side, but it was a tactical win in that it cut off the supply lines. So Cornwallis was actually never able to recover his supplies, and that's what ended the war. Had it not been for that moment, it's entirely possible we'd still be a British colony.
Well, and speaking about the Constitutional Convention, I think we actually have a viewer question about that.
Yes. So the person said that the Senate just passed a resolution for another one recently and wanted to know what that means for today.
So the question is about a constitutional convention today, and what does that mean? And is that a good or a bad thing?
Well, we don't know yet, right? I think a lot of us are pretty nervous about it. Historically, it's been a fairly good thing, right? In the past, when North Carolina had its first constitutional convention, it was North Carolina that changed the wording from all men are created equal to all people are created equal. And this is a long time before, women's suffrage, the 14th or 15th Amendment. So a lot of foresight coming out of the original Constitution for North Carolina. We could see something that great. It's probable that we will not right now.
So it is fair to say that what happened here in North Carolina really did shape the outcome of the war.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. And then in the post-war period there were some interesting things about universities, which here in the Triangle, of course, we're really proud of our universities, and I think there's some important things to note about that, right?
Right, so we've talked a little bit about the colonial era and the Revolution and those being real periods of disruption. After the conclusion of the American Revolution, we focused on building a nation, and that was the Constitutional Convention, but it was also North Carolina was the first state to put together a public university system and the only one to graduate students in the 18th century. So education has always been a really big part of North Carolina history.
Very cool. So that could be the first, help me, because I'm not that knowledgeable as you. So that was really the end of the first Reconstruction period, the disruption period, the Reconstruction, that's what was known or led into then the Civil War, right?
I would think of it more as a construction period at that point, right? Because we're building the nation.
Okay.
But yes, if we fast forward a little bit, we get into the Civil War. North Carolina had some of the absolute harshest slavery laws of any of the colonies. Whether it was because of this or despite that, North Carolina also led the abolitionist movement. And in fact, the first underground railroad station was just outside of Greensboro, North Carolina. And that was on Levi Coffin's property right next to Reverend Caldwell, who was also a fighting minister, soldier, surgeon during the American Revolution. So some of the same characters again come back.
Right.
Just like Richard Caswell we mentioned earlier, he goes from being in Tryon's army to patriot, and he actually became the first governor of North Carolina once it was a state.
Cool. So what was our representation then like at that point in the Reconstruction for North Carolina?
Right, so after the Civil War, quite a bit of money, attention, et cetera, was put into this very formal Reconstruction effort. And so this included even federal funding into North Carolina. We had a couple dozen African-American senators, representatives, and lots of merchants, right? So we had Oberlin Village at the time, which is now Cameron Village. And it was really a time of prosperity for a lot of people who had lived through slavery and the conclusion of the war.
So, again, jumping ahead a little bit, then how did we go from having that kind of representation for African Americans to this era of Jim Crow?
So this is a good question, and it's definitely, we're skipping ahead and kind of summarizing here, but I think the answer is fear. We had a broad coalition of people coming together to build the state. We had people from all different walks of life, religious and non, whites and blacks, and I think it concerned a lot of people. It concerned the working poor whites, the rich whites, and so what we end up seeing is
The diversity, the different people coming around? Was it
the diversity
threatening, you think, or
that and the prosperity, right?
Okay.
Because that was an economic threat to sort of the status quo. Thank you for pointing that out. And what happens is we start to disenfranchise different African American voters. The then Democratic Party was able to keep the same representation. So they ended up with an absolute majority in both the Senate and the House. And these laws, the poll taxes, grandfather clauses, kind of got worse and worse. At the same time, we had a social element to it, right? We talk a lot about disruption and social movement. Klan membership peaked in the 1920s. And so between those two things, from the 20s into the 70s, we have what's called the Great Migration, where 5 million African American people left the American South. Just 5 million people.
that's just
Stunning for the time.
That is stunning for that time. That is. So after that, the migration, again, sorry to keep moving you forward, but after that migration, then did we go through another period of Reconstruction, disruption? How would you characterize that then?
So I think that's exactly right. And we look at the civil rights movement, that whole era from the mid-50s through the mid-60s in particular, as that second great Reconstruction. This is when we had Brown versus the Board of Education, the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Act, all those passed in the 60s. So these were all important things for kind of bringing people back together and really getting rid of the pro laws. This is another area where you see a lot going on in North Carolina. There were sit-ins. There was a massacre in the Greensboro Massacre. And even up into the 70s, you see things like the Wilmington 10, which was 10 people who were falsely imprisoned. And in fact, were not released until, again, this mixture of fusion politics. It was media, religious groups, labor unions, etc., who kind of helped free these people.
Right. Legal strategies fused again with social movements,
Exactly.
right? And campaigns of all kinds of civil resistance.
Exactly.
So, what from this history then applies to today?
I think almost all of it does, right? We don't want to just rely on history and say we can build from that and that's going to be our playbook for today. But fusion politics, talking about what we think of now as intersectionality, feminist movements, civil rights movements, labor, et cetera, all these groups joining together. When minorities stand together, they're no longer a minority. So I think that's a huge part of it. This is part of what Reverend Barber refers to as this third Reconstruction that's coming. Mm-hmm. So I think a lot of that's the same. What's different is probably the rate of change. There's so much information, and change happens so quickly that we have a hard time keeping up with it. So adaptability and those sort of values fusion, I think, is really important today. So we can rely on the past, but we also have to be able to adapt more quickly than we did before.
Right. And I so appreciate, we have another question from a viewer.
Yes, we have another question.
Sorry.
So the question, what are some key elections we should be focused on in the upcoming months?
All of them. Yeah, I hate to say it, but all of them. So we do have some key elections coming up. We were hoping actually for 2017 elections, but we didn't get through our redistricting. So 2018 is going to be really interesting. North Carolina, both the Democratic Party and the GOP have quite a bit in their pipeline. You'll see a lot more information coming from those.
And I think that's a really great question because I think everyone wants to do something, right? Mm-hmm. We want to take all this information that you gave us, think about where North Carolina is and where we want to be, and that's another reason for this series of Facebook events, is to make sure we can do a deep dive on a lot of these topics, carry that information forward, connect it to our calls to action that you'll see on Facebook. And we have a lot of resources for that as well. There's a Stronger NC newsletter. And again, this information will be available to you. There is a This Is What Democracy Looks Like Facebook page where you can submit topics and questions for future broadcasts. Very importantly, you can pay attention when there is a call to action on the website saying, to write, to call, to email your representative. Find out who your representatives are, what they stand for, what's important. Remind them that the nation is watching North Carolina, where we've been and where we're going, and let's make it a good example to follow.
We talked a lot about the historical precedent, but today this is true too, right? So think about things like gerrymandering, HB2, DOMA finally going away. All these issues are things that have been really big in North Carolina. Unfortunately, when we passed HB2, a handful of other states started to do the same. Gerrymandering in particular is going to be a really big one. And we do have an episode coming up exclusively on that. When we kind of get back to calls to action, I wanted to mention gerrymandering because the term itself almost sounds a little benign. It doesn't seem that. But what we have so far is two redistrictings that have been ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because they were racially gerrymandered. And so when we get back to calls to actions, one of the things we say is we have to start having the uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
We don't like to talk about things like race. We don't like to talk about uncomfortable subjects. But we really have to start having those conversations. It's going to come up again in the redistricting.
Right. And I think pushing for the information and the knowledge and having those uncomfortable conversations is going to be really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm. And that's why, again, as you mentioned, we do have a Facebook Live event on July 11th because the first Tuesday in July is actually July 4th, so most of you will not be watching us live, at least for this reason. We'll go more in depth on that topic and what we can do to help ensure fair districting. And then on June 6th, actually next month, we're going to do a session on welcoming you to the General Assembly. And we're going to go on a field trip and take viewers to the North Carolina General Assembly, explain how the House and Senate work, hopefully talk to some representatives, and help everybody figure out, again, how to get from this information and knowledge to what they can do.
Right.
And I think you and I have always talked about that.
Yeah, exactly. We want to be able to connect the dots between, what we can do, our knowledge and our information, and, what we want to do with it next. And so the People's House, we want to go on a tour of the People's House. We're going to show you how to get to both sides, Senate and the House, talk to some representatives. And then with our calls to action, we're going to have some that are very brief, things that you can do in just a couple of minutes, to things that are much more involved. So hopefully it'll be the decision. You'll get a little bit of education and then decide what you want to take forward.
That's right. And I think we heard our alarm that maybe our time is up.
Yeah, I think we're off. Do we have any other questions?
I think that's it.
Okay.
Well, Crystal, thank you so much. I love the way all this history rolls off your tongue, makes it come to life. And here we are again with it coming to life in North Carolina. So we hope everyone joins us in the future for our Facebook Live events. And thanks for tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.